Hello and welcome to the ScrapbookPal YouTube channel. I'm Jill with Jill Cameron Creations, and today we're going to be using the Gina K Beautiful Butterflies stamp set and die set. First, I'm going to create a watercolor background without using watercolor. Okay, it is watercolor, but it's powdered watercolor. So I have a pretty large piece of watercolor paper here, and I'm just going to create a background. The first thing that I like to do is spray the back side of my watercolor paper so that it doesn't warp. Using that technique, I don't have to tape anything down and I get minimal warping. We are using Cosmic Shimmer, Pixie Sparkles, and Groovy Grape and Beyond Blue, as well as Pixie Burst in Making Waves and Purple Orchid. The front side of my paper, I started out dry, and then I added my powders in different places and sprayed it. I'm using a distress sprayer. Continue to add different shimmer powders in different areas on my background and waited a moment to see how they kind of played out because I already had water on my background, but I added more water, spraying from a distance and up close to get different effects. You'll see that I kept different colors in different areas, but they all blended together very nicely. Set this aside to dry overnight. Cosmic Shimmer powders and the Pixie powders bursts have beautiful shimmer in them in all different colors. So there's our finished panel, and you can see that I have different blocks of color in 4 different areas. I cut it down in the middle approximately, just so it would fit through my die cutting machine later. These beautiful butterflies in the stamp set are really detailed, but the dies leave open areas for the background to show through. I'm heat embossing the butterflies in white embossing powder. I do recommend that you use a really finely milled embossing powder because these stamps are so detailed. They're absolutely gorgeous. I stamped them in VersaMark ink twice to make sure I got good coverage because I am stamping on watercolor paper, so it does have some texture to it. And you'll see that I missed that top corner of the wing on the butterfly both times when I stamped it, but that's not a big deal. I can play with that when I go to lay out my butterflies on our slimline panel. I heat embossed the 3 largest butterflies in white embossing powder on our panel. And you'll notice I did not use any anti-static powder tool on this because if the white embossing powder got somewhere I didn't want it, it was okay because the rest of the panel is going to be used for other stuff anyway. I keep my embossing powder still in the jar because I end up making a huge mess if I put these in a container of some description and still use a coffee filter. I will reuse that coffee filter 100 times or more until it's just absolutely fallen apart. And even after all of these years of crafting, probably my favorite thing is still watching embossing powder melt. Now before I put my MISTI away, I'm going to go ahead and stamp my sentiment. I'm using the Tiny Little Friend sentiment that's included in the stamp set, and I'm going to white heat emboss that on black cardstock. I am going to cut this into a strip, and even though I used my anti-static powder tool, I did get a little bit of embossing powder in places I didn't want to get it. So I'm going to make sure that I remove all of that anti-static powder, and I also want to remove some little bits of the embossing powder that melted on my cardstock. So I used a white eraser and a sand eraser to make sure I got those spots off. Cut this down into a strip. I'm using my Holtz paper trimmer. This is the smaller one that I absolutely love. It is perfect. Now, have you seen that Gina K includes these absolutely wonderful magnetic sheets? These are the heavy ones that have like the backer board on them to store your dies. And the magnetic sheets are included with the die. Now I'm going to go ahead and tape down my dies that go with each individual image that I stamped previously. That little half butterfly, the die has the antenna included with it, so it looks a little bit odd, but it is the die that goes with that particular half of the butterfly. I use a Spellbinders Platinum 6 die cutting machine, and I also wanted to go ahead and die cut some of solid images of the background with a mid-sized butterfly and also the tiny little butterfly to fill in some of the open spaces in my background. We're making a slimline card. And I trimmed down just a sliver of black cardstock that was out of my scrap pile, and I'm going to have that line over on the left hand side of my panel, and I'm going to cross that over with our sentiment. But first we need to figure out where all of our butterflies go. I'm going to pop some of these butterflies up with foam tape, and then I'm going to glue some of these flat down. And today, for some reason, my hands were shaking a little bit, so I went ahead and pulled out my handy dandy press and seal from, you know, my kitchen stash, because that's where you go and get craft supplies. I pulled that out so that I could have my layout in the exact place I wanted it. Sometimes when you press it down, little things like that little butterfly will, from static cling, will stick to it. And I went ahead and just repositioned that and make sure everything was where I still wanted it, pressed everything down really well, and then pulled it off of the background. I'm creating backgrounds with lots of die cuts on them like this. I'll use my press and seal stuff all the time. It's a great handy little tool. Now I'm going to go ahead and put adhesive, liquid adhesive, on the backs of everything that I'm gluing flat down, and then I'll also go ahead and put the foam squares on the backs of the ones that are going to be popped up. I'm not adhering my sentiment strip just yet because I'm going to slide that in after everything is placed. The press and seal makes it super easy for me to lay everything back down on my panel exactly where I wanted it. One thing I noticed as I was putting this down is I still had some really open white spaces, and that's perfectly fine, but I wanted a little bit more in there. So I'm going to go back after I put my sentiment in and add a few more of the small little teeny tiny little butterflies, and cut a few more from our background pieces. Unfortunately, the camera does not pick up the absolutely fantastic texture of that background and all the different speckles of it, because that shine just does not show up well on camera, but it is absolutely gorgeous. These butterflies are super sparkly, super shiny, and have tons of different textures in them just because of that pixie dust. That pixie sparkles and the pixie burst are just absolutely gorgeous, and it's all of that different pigment in there. The stamp set Beautiful Butterflies also has the trails from all of your little butterflies. Well, I wanted to have a couple of trails in here, but I had already, put everything down, so I just used some post-it notes to cover up my butterflies that were in my background. Just added a few little trails here and there to some of the smaller butterflies. Since I have the black strips in the background, I went ahead and used my Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, which I use to Copic color mostly, but it's also a great black ink. Then one added little touch, I went ahead and added some jewels to the center of all the tiny little butterflies. These are Pink Fresh Studios Glacier, I believe. They're the white ones with the iridescent on the top of them. Absolutely beautiful, and I used the smallest size that's included in there. The jewel picker that I'm using is a Maker Forte jewel picker, and it has the pointy pick on the other end of it, and it's this rainbow, and I absolutely love it, and there are replaceable tips for it too. I'm using Nuvo Deluxe adhesive as my liquid adhesive, and now we just need to set this aside to dry for a few moments so that we can trim off the edges. So I'm going to flip this over on its back, and I'm just using my finger to align the edge to cut off the edges of the butterfly and the extra black strip over here on the side. Watch your fingers, make sure that your fingers are out of the way before you cut, of course. And last but definitely not least, we're going to add this to a 110-pound cardstock background card base here, and I'm using my liquid adhesive and popping that on. And I like to set my cards over on the side a little bit and make sure that they're all nice and even before it goes down. Thanks so much for joining me today. Have a great day.